What if staying means slowing your life down for someone you love, and you're afraid you might become their burden? Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet but deeply emotional chapter where love isn't tested by pain, but by time, patience, and the fear of holding someone back. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning arrived quietly in the hospital, the kind of quiet that didn't announce itself but slowly revealed its presence. The light slipped in through the narrow gap between the curtains, pale and gentle, resting on the white sheets as if it didn't want to disturb anyone. Diep woke before the machines made their first soft beeps of the day. For a moment she stayed still, listening. The hallway outside was calm, no hurried footsteps, no urgent voices, just the distant hum of the place that never truly slept. She turned her head slightly. James was there. He sat in the chair beside her bed, his jacket folded neatly over the backrest, sleeves of his shirt rolled up. A thin folder rested on his lap, unopened. His eyes weren't on the papers, they were on her. He didn't smile when their eyes met. He didn't say good morning right away. He simply looked relieved, as if the day starting with her awake was enough. "You're up early," he said softly. Diep nodded. "Couldn't sleep." James leaned forward a little. "Do you feel okay?" She searched her body for an answer. The pain wasn't sharp. The weakness wasn't new. Everything felt familiar now. Too familiar. "I'm fine," she said. And this time, it wasn't entirely a lie. James reached for the cup of water on the small table, checking its temperature before handing it to her. She took a sip, slow and careful, as if even swallowing required thought these days. Neither of them spoke after that. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was practiced. They had learned how to sit in it together, how to let it breathe without rushing to fill it with words. But inside Diep, something was shifting. She stared at the ceiling, at the tiny crack near the corner she had memorized over the past days. It had become her marker of time. If she followed it long enough with her eyes, she could forget where she was, but this morning she couldn't forget. Her thoughts moved forward instead of circling back. What if this doesn't end soon? What if I stay like this longer than anyone expects? She didn't turn those thoughts into questions out loud. She didn't look at James when they arrived. She kept them tucked away, careful not to let them touch the air between them. James stood up quietly. "I'll get you some breakfast." Diep nodded again. As he stepped toward the door, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He paused, glanced at the screen, then answered with his voice lowered. "Yes, I understand. I'll take care of it." It wasn't a long call, less than a minute. He didn't step out into the hallway. He didn't turn his back on her. But Diep noticed anyway. She noticed the way his tone changed, the way responsibility settled into his posture so naturally, the way the world outside this room still knew how to reach him. When he hung up, he caught her looking. "Work," he said simply. "Nothing urgent." She smiled, quick and light. "It's okay." And it was okay. But something inside her tightened. The breakfast arrived soon after. Simple, warm, familiar. James adjusted the tray, helped her sit up a little more comfortably. He moved with ease, with the confidence of someone who had repeated these motions enough times to stop thinking about them. "You don't have to," Diep started. "I know," James said gently, "but I want to." She let him feed her a few bites. The room filled with the quiet rhythm of spoon, breath, pause. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with care. Yet the more tender it felt, the heavier Diep's chest became. Halfway through, she shook her head. "I think that's enough." James studied her face. "You sure?" "Yes." He didn't insist. He set the tray aside, wiped his hands, then leaned back into the chair. "You look tired," Diep said. James smiled faintly. "I'm okay." She watched him closely this time, the faint shadows under his eyes, The tension he didn't talk about. The way he always said he was fine, even when she knew he wasn't resting enough. "Maybe you should go home for a bit," she said carefully. James blinked. "What?" "Just to shower. Sleep properly," she added quickly. "I'll be asleep most of the day anyway." He didn't answer right away. Diep felt a sudden urge to explain herself, to soften the words before they sounded like something else. "I mean, just for a while. You've been here every day." "I want to be," James said. "I know," she replied too fast. Then she slowed. "But you don't have to be all the time." The space between them shifted. James looked at her longer now, not searching for a symptom but for a reason. "Do you want me to go?" he asked gently. The question landed heavier than she expected. Diep looked away. "I just think maybe you should rest." James nodded slowly. "Okay." He stood, but he didn't move toward the door right away. He picked up his jacket, folded it over his arm, then hesitated. "I'll be back later," he said. "If you need anything." "I know," she said softly. He paused, then reached out and brushed his thumb lightly against the back of her hand. Not a promise, not reassurance, just contact. When the door closed behind him, the room felt larger, too quiet. Diep lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling again. But the crack didn't distract her today. Her thoughts grew louder. He has a life waiting outside this room. I don't. The idea wasn't bitter, it was factual, and somehow that made it hurt more. She imagined weeks stretching on like this, days measured by medication schedules and doctor visits, James rearranging meetings, postponing plans, choosing this room over everything else. Her chest tightened. What if one day he doesn't say it out loud, but he feels it? Staying here cost him something he never gets back. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Crying felt too dramatic for something so quiet, so internal. Time passed slowly after that. A nurse came in, a routine check, a gentle smile. Words Diep had heard before. "You're doing okay." Okay felt like a word without edges. When the room was empty again, Diep finally let herself turn her head toward the door. She knew James wouldn't come back for a while. That was the point. Still, her fingers curled slightly into the sheets where his hand had been. She didn't want distance. She just didn't want to be the reason he stopped moving forward. Outside, James leaned against the wall in the hallway, exhaling slowly. He hadn't gone far. He didn't plan to. He understood more than she knew. He knew the look in her eyes when she asked him to rest. He knew the fear that hid behind her calm voice. And for the first time since she'd been admitted, he realized something clearly. Being there wasn't just about staying close. Sometimes staying meant knowing when to step back without leaving. He straightened, checked the time, and made a quiet decision. This wasn't about today. It was about tomorrow, and every day after. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor, stretching longer as the hours passed. Shadows from the window frame climbed the wall, then retreated, marking time in a way the clock never could. Diep had slept, but not deeply. She drifted in and out of half-dreams, each one dissolving before it could settle. When she finally opened her eyes again, the room felt unfamiliar for a moment. Too quiet, too empty. James wasn't there. She knew he wouldn't be. She had asked for it. Still, the absence pressed against her chest like a weight she hadn't anticipated. A nurse entered softly, checking her chart, adjusting the IV with practiced hands. "How are you feeling now?" she asked. Diep considered the question carefully. "The same," she answered. The nurse nodded. "The doctor will come by later this afternoon. We just want to keep monitoring a few things." "Is something wrong?" Diep asked, trying to keep her voice even. "Not wrong," the nurse said gently. "Just slower than we expected." The words settled heavily between them. Slower. After the nurse left, Diep stared at the ceiling again, but this time her thoughts refused to scatter. They lined up neatly, one after another, each one more persistent than the last. Slower means longer. Longer means more waiting. More waiting means more of him giving things up. She pressed her lips together, forcing the ache down. This was the part she hadn't told James. The part she couldn't say without sounding ungrateful or afraid. She didn't want to be brave. She just wanted to stop feeling like time was something she was stealing. The door opened quietly. James stepped back into the room, carrying a small paper bag. He paused when he saw her awake, relief flickering across his face before he softened it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied. He set the bag down on the table. "I brought you something warm, the kind you like." She smiled faintly. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, as if the words had become a habit. He pulled the chair closer, sitting beside her again, this time without his jacket, without his phone in his hand. Just him. For a moment they existed like that, quiet, present, careful not to disturb the fragile balance they had created. Then Diep spoke. "Did I make you uncomfortable earlier?" she asked softly. James looked at her surprised. "No, I didn't want you to think I was pushing you away." "I didn't," he said immediately. Then more slowly, "I thought you needed space." She nodded. "I did. I think." He studied her face. "And now?" She hesitated. "Now I don't know." James didn't smile this time. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on the edge of the bed, close enough for her to touch if she wanted. "You don't have to know," he said. "We can figure it out as we go." Diep swallowed. The nurse said things might take longer. James nodded once. "I heard." That surprised her. "You did?" "I asked," he admitted. "I wanted to be prepared." The word landed differently than she expected. Prepared. "For how long?" she asked quietly. "They didn't give a clear timeline," James said. "Just that we shouldn't rush it." Diep's fingers curled into the sheets. "I don't want you to pause your life because of me," she said, the words finally escaping before she could stop them. James looked at her carefully now. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" She didn't answer right away. Her silence was answer enough. James leaned back slightly, considering his response, as if he knew this moment mattered. "I'm not pausing my life," he said. "I'm adjusting it." She looked at him, unsure. "There's a difference," he continued. "Pausing means waiting for something to end before you move again. Adjusting means finding a way to move forward without leaving something behind." Diep's eyes softened, but the tension didn't disappear. "What if adjusting still cost you something?" she asked. James smiled gently. "Everything meaningful costs something." She looked down. "That's what I'm afraid of." He reached out then, placing his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. "I'm not here because I feel obligated," he said quietly. "And I'm not staying because I don't know what else to do." "Then why?" she asked. "Because this is where I choose to be," he replied. "Even if it's slower, even if it's uncertain." Her throat tightened. For the first time that day, she let the tears come, not in a rush, not dramatically, just a few that slipped free before she could stop them. "I don't want to be the reason you regret anything," she whispered. James squeezed her hand gently. "You're not." "How can you be sure?" she asked. "Because regret comes from doing something against your will," he said. "And I'm here willingly." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to memorize the truth of his face in case she ever needed to remind herself. A soft knock interrupted them. The doctor entered, calm and professional, his voice steady as he explained the situation. Diep listened closely, every word imprinting itself on her. The recovery was progressing, but more slowly than expected. They recommended extending her stay, observing a few key indicators before making any decisions about discharge. "It's not dangerous," the doctor said, "but it requires patience." Patience. After he left, the room felt different. The uncertainty had a shape now, a name. "How do you feel?" James asked quietly. "Tired," Diep admitted. "Not physically, just tired of not knowing." James nodded. "We'll take it one day at a time." She watched him carefully. "You keep saying 'we.'" He smiled. "Because that's how I see it." She leaned back against the pillows, letting the weight of the day settle. For the first time, she didn't push it away. "Can you stay a little longer?" she asked. James didn't answer right away. He stood, adjusting the chair, then pulled it closer to her bed. "I was planning to," he said. She exhaled, something inside her loosening at last. As evening approached, the light softened again, wrapping the room in warmth that felt almost undeserved. Diep rested her head against his shoulder. James didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stayed still enough to be a place she could lean on. "Are you really okay with this?" she asked quietly. "With staying?" he asked. "With the waiting," she clarified. James considered the question, then answered honestly. "I don't love the waiting, but I love what I'm waiting for." She closed her eyes. Outside, the hospital continued its rhythm, doors opening, footsteps passing, lives intersecting briefly before moving on. Inside the room, time slowed again, not because it was being held back, but because for the first time neither of them was running ahead of it.
Mọi người, trong tập này Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.